He thought the badge made him untouchable, until the moment it didn't. The late afternoon air hung heavy over downtown Baltimore, thick with the distant hum of traffic and the low murmur of pedestrians moving along the sidewalk, people wrapped in their own routines, their own quiet worlds, until that single moment fractured everything. Officer Daniel Hayes stepped forward with the kind of confidence that didn't ask for permission, his posture rigid, his voice already sharpened with judgment before a single word left his mouth, because in his mind the scene was already decided, already understood, already controlled, and standing just a few feet in front of him was Naomi Carter, a woman who didn't raise her voice, didn't step back, didn't even shift her stance as his presence closed in around her like a tightening circle, her dark coat catching the faint breeze, her expression calm in a way that didn't match the tension building around her. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to cooperate," Hayes said, loud enough for nearby strangers to turn their heads, loud enough for attention to gather like gravity pulling everything inward. And it did. Phones subtly lifting, conversations pausing, curiosity sharpening into quiet anticipation, because scenes like this had a rhythm people recognized, a script they'd seen before, and Hayes leaned into it, stepping closer, his eyes scanning her as if searching for something he had already decided was there. Naomi didn't respond. Not immediately, not emotionally, just a steady gaze that met his without challenge, but without submission either, the kind of stillness that unsettles more than resistance ever could. And for a split second, something flickered in Hayes' expression, something uncertain, but it vanished just as quickly as it came, replaced by a firmer tone, a louder edge, because control once questioned has to be reasserted. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he added, his hand gesturing toward her coat, and then, without waiting, without asking again, he reached forward and pulled the fabric away from her shoulders, not violently, not chaotically, but with a forceful certainty that made the gesture echo louder than it should have, the coat slipping down and landing against the concrete with a soft, final sound that seemed to silence everything around them. For a moment, no one moved, the city itself holding its breath, because what had just happened wasn't just about a coat. It was about the shift in atmosphere, the invisible line that had been crossed in plain sight, and Naomi stood there exactly as she had before, composed, unshaken, her posture unchanged as if nothing essential about her had been touched, while Hayes straightened slightly, expecting something, an argument, a reaction, a crack in her calm, but none came. Instead, Naomi slowly turned her head, not toward him, but toward the small crowd that had gathered, her eyes scanning the faces, the phones, the silent witnesses, and then back to him. And when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, controlled, almost measured to the point of precision. "Officer Hayes," she said, using his name in a way that landed heavier than any accusation. "Are you sure you want to continue this?" And the question didn't sound like fear, didn't sound like defiance. It sounded like something else entirely. Something that didn't fit the script Hayes thought he was writing. And for the first time, the ground beneath his certainty shifted just slightly, not enough for anyone else to see, but enough to matter. The question lingered in the air longer than it should have, stretching across the silence like a thin wire pulled too tight. And for a brief moment Officer Hayes did not respond, not because he did not hear her, but because something in the way she said his name refused to settle into the version of reality he had already constructed in his mind. He narrowed his eyes slightly, shifting his weight as if to re-establish control over a situation that no longer felt as simple as it had seconds ago. And the faint sound of a phone camera clicking somewhere in the crowd snapped him back in motion, reminding him that eyes were watching, that this was no longer just an interaction but a performance he could not afford to lose. "You do not get to ask questions here," he replied, his voice firmer now, louder, pushing against the quiet tension that had begun to surround them. And yet, even as he spoke, there was a subtle hesitation tucked beneath his words, something almost imperceptible but present enough to exist, and Naomi noticed it, not with a reaction, not with a shift in posture, but with a stillness that seemed to deepen, as if she were allowing the moment to unfold exactly as it needed to. The crowd had grown thicker now, a half-circle of strangers forming at a cautious distance, their expressions a mix of curiosity, discomfort, and anticipation, because scenes like this carried a familiar weight, one that people recognized even if they did not fully understand it. And among them stood a man in a gray suit, his hands loosely at his sides, his gaze fixed not on Hayes, but on Naomi, as if waiting for something specific, something precise. Hayes glanced down briefly at the coat on the ground, then back at her, searching again for a reaction that refused to come, and that absence began to press against him in ways he could not explain, because he was used to resistance, used to arguments, used to voices rising to meet his own. But this calm, this controlled silence, it did not give him anything to push against. It did not fit the script, and that made it dangerous in a way he could not name. "I am going to ask you one more time," he continued, each word deliberate, as if repetition alone could restore order. "What are you doing here?" And Naomi let a small pause settle between them before answering. Not rushed, not defensive, but measured, as though every second she allowed to pass carried weight of its own. "Walking," she said simply, her voice even, almost disarmingly so, and a faint murmur rippled through the crowd, not because of what she said, but because of how she said it, because there was no fear in it, no urgency, just a quiet certainty that did not belong in a moment like this. Hayes exhaled through his nose, the sound sharper now, and he took a half step closer, lowering his voice just enough that it no longer carried to the edges of the crowd, but still loud enough for those nearest to hear. "You think this is a joke," he said, and for the first time, Naomi's expression shifted, not into anger, not into fear, but into something closer to recognition, as if she had been waiting for him to reach this exact point. And when she spoke again, her tone remained steady, but there was something new beneath it, something that felt less like a response and more like a warning delivered too late to change anything. "No, officer," she said quietly, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "I think this is exactly what it looks like." And somewhere behind them, the low hum of an approaching vehicle blended into the background noise of the city, unnoticed by most, but not by everyone, and certainly not by the man in the gray suit, whose attention sharpened just slightly, as if the next moment had already begun to arrive. The sound of the approaching vehicle grew clearer now, a low steady engine cutting through the layered noise of the city, and while most of the crowd remained focused on the standoff in front of them, a few heads turned instinctively, sensing a shift they could not yet explain. But Naomi did not look away from Officer Hayes, her attention fixed, unwavering, as if everything unfolding around them was already accounted for, already part of a sequence she had seen play out before. Hayes followed, her gaze for a fraction of a second, just enough to register the black sedan easing to a stop along the curb, its presence subtle but deliberate, the kind of vehicle that did not belong to chance. And something in his posture tightened again, not visibly to the crowd, but internally, a small recalibration of awareness that he could not quite justify. "You are not answering my question," he said, though his voice no longer carried the same sharp edge it had moments ago, as if some invisible resistance had dulled it slightly. And Naomi tilted her head just a fraction, considering him, not with irritation, not with impatience, but with a level of composure that felt almost out of place in the tension of the moment. "I already did," she replied, her tone even, and that answer, simple as it was, seemed to frustrate him more than any argument could have, because it left no opening, no leverage, no escalation he could easily justify, without exposing the imbalance that was beginning to show behind them. The door of the sedan opened with a quiet, controlled motion, and a second man stepped out, dressed in a dark suit, his movements precise, his eyes scanning the scene not with curiosity, but with purpose. And the man in the gray suit who had been standing among the crowd shifted his stance almost imperceptibly, acknowledging the arrival without drawing attention to it, as if both of them were pieces of the same unseen structure now locking into place. Hayes noticed them this time, his gaze flicking past Naomi, lingering just long enough to register that something about their presence did not match the randomness of bystanders. And when his eyes returned to her, there was a new question forming behind them, one he had not yet spoken but could no longer ignore. "Do you know them?" he asked, the words coming out more measured now, less certain. And Naomi let a brief silence settle again, not as hesitation, but as control, as timing, before she answered, "Yes." And that single word seemed to land heavier than it should have, because it confirmed something without explaining it. It pointed to a connection without revealing its nature, and Hayes felt it. That shift, that subtle loss of footing that comes when a situation begins to move beyond your understanding. The crowd sensed it too, the energy changing, the earlier tension giving way to something quieter but more intense, as if everyone present was beginning to realize that what they were witnessing was no longer a routine encounter. And somewhere in the distance a siren echoed faintly, not urgent, not immediate, but enough to add another layer to the moment. Hayes straightened slightly, adjusting his stance, trying to reclaim the authority that had started to slip through his fingers. "Then you can have them step back," he said, gesturing loosely toward the men near the car. But even as he spoke, the request sounded thinner than he intended, less like a command and more like an attempt to restore order in a space that was no longer responding to him the way it had before. Naomi's eyes followed his gesture briefly, acknowledging the direction without turning her body, and when she looked back at him, there was something unmistakable in her expression now, not confrontation, not defiance, but certainty, the kind that does not need to raise its voice to be heard. "They are exactly where they need to be," she said quietly, and the words settled over the scene with a finality that could not be undone, because in that moment, whether Hayes understood it fully or not, the control he believed he held had already begun to shift away from him, piece by piece, decision by decision, towards something far more deliberate than he had ever anticipated. The words settled into the space between them like a quiet line, drawn in ink, impossible to erase once seen, and Officer Hayes felt it. That subtle but undeniable shift where the situation no longer moved in response to him, but instead around him, as if he had stepped into something already in motion without realizing it. He glanced again toward the two men near the black sedan, noticing now the way they stood, not relaxed, not uncertain, but positioned, deliberate, their attention not scattered like the crowd but focused, anchored, and when his eyes returned to Naomi, there was a flicker of calculation behind them. The kind that appears when instinct begins to question certainty. "This is still an active stop," he said, attempting to ground himself in procedure, in something structured, something familiar. But the words felt thinner now, less solid than they had just moments ago, and Naomi did not interrupt, did not challenge. She simply let him speak, let him fill the silence that she had already mastered. The faint echo of footsteps approached from behind him, measured and unhurried. And though Hayes did not turn immediately, he was aware of it, aware in the way a person senses when attention is no longer theirs alone, when the center of gravity has shifted, and the man in the dark suit came to a stop just a few feet away, close enough to be present, far enough to not intrude, his voice calm when he finally spoke. "Officer Hayes," he said, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a clarity that carried weight without effort. And Hayes turned then, his posture tightening as he took in the man's appearance, the badge clipped discreetly at his belt, the composure that mirrored Naomi's in a way that was not coincidental. "And you are?" Hayes asked, though the question sounded less like authority and more like necessity, and the man answered without hesitation. "United States Marshals Service," he said, his tone steady, and a subtle murmur rippled through the crowd at the mention, the kind of reaction that comes when something official, something beyond the ordinary, enters a situation that had seemed contained just moments before. Hayes felt the ground shift again, more noticeably this time, the boundaries of his control narrowing, and he straightened, attempting to recalibrate. "This does not concern you," he replied, though even as he said it, the words lacked the certainty they once carried, and the man did not argue, did not step forward. He simply held his position, his presence alone enough to change the balance of the scene. Naomi watched this exchange without interruption, her gaze steady, her expression composed, and when Hayes looked back at her, there was something different in his eyes now, not yet understanding, but no longer dismissive, as if the pieces he had ignored were beginning to align whether he wanted them to or not. "Ma'am," Hayes said again, his voice quieter this time, more controlled. "I need to verify your identity." And the request lingered there, suspended between them, because it was no longer just a demand. It was a question shaped by uncertainty, shaped by the realization that he might not be the one defining the situation anymore. Naomi let a brief pause stretch, not out of hesitation, but out of intention, the kind of pause that forces attention, that pulls every eye, every breath into its orbit. And then, slowly, she bent just enough to retrieve her coat from the ground, her movements unhurried, precise, as if the moment itself belonged to her now, as if time adjusted to her pace rather than the other way around. And as she straightened, she did not rush to speak, did not rush to explain. She simply reached into the inner pocket of the coat, her gaze never leaving his, and in that silence, in that controlled stillness, the entire scene seemed to hold its breath. Because whatever came next was no longer uncertain, it was inevitable. Her hand moved with quiet precision into the inner pocket of the coat, and in that single motion, something shifted across the entire scene, not visibly at first, not in a way that could be named, but in a way that could be felt, like the moment before a storm breaks when the air itself seems to tighten. Officer Hayes watched closely now, his earlier confidence replaced by a focus that bordered on unease. Because whatever she was about to reveal no longer felt like a simple answer to a routine question. It felt like the answer to something much larger, something he had not realized he was part of. The crowd leaned in without stepping forward, their attention drawn to that small, deliberate movement. Phones steady, eyes locked, because instinct told them that this was the turning point, the moment everything would change. Naomi did not rush, did not dramatize. She simply withdrew a slim leather case, dark and unassuming, the kind that carried weight not through appearance but through what it represented, and for a brief second she held it there, not as a threat, not as a challenge, but as a fact waiting to be acknowledged. Hayes' gaze dropped to it, then lifted back to her face, searching, calculating, trying to anticipate what came next. But the silence she maintained offered him nothing to work with, nothing to push against. And that absence of control pressed heavier on him than any confrontation could have. Go ahead, he said finally, the words measured, careful, as if choosing them more deliberately than before, and Naomi gave a slight nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, and then she opened the case. The movement was simple, almost understated, but the effect was immediate, because inside, neatly placed, was an official identification, unmistakable in its design, its authority evident, even from a distance, and though the details were not yet spoken aloud, the meaning of it began to ripple outward, first to Hayes, then to the man from the United States Marshal Service, and finally to the watching crowd, who could sense without fully understanding that something significant had just entered the moment. Hayes leaned in slightly, just enough to read, just enough to confirm, and as his eyes moved across the identification, the change in his expression was subtle but undeniable. The kind of shift that happens when certainty collapses inward on itself, when the narrative you believed you controlled is suddenly rewritten in front of you. Naomi did not fill the silence. She let it expand, let him process, let the realization settle at its own pace. And when she finally spoke, her voice remained steady, calm, carrying no anger, no triumph, only clarity. Naomi Carter, she said, as if introducing herself for the first time, though in truth she had been known long before. This moment, United States District Judge, and the title landed with a weight that extended far beyond the words themselves, because it was not just a role, it was authority, it was oversight, it was the kind of position that did not enter situations like this by accident. Hayes straightened almost instinctively, his posture adjusting as the implications unfolded, and for a brief moment he said nothing, because there was nothing immediate to say, nothing that could undo what had already happened, and somewhere behind him, the man from the Marshal Service took a small step closer, not aggressively, not forcefully, but with a presence that reinforced what had just been revealed, that confirmed this was no misunderstanding, no coincidence. Naomi closed the case with the same controlled motion she had opened it, returning it to her coat pocket as if the reveal itself required no further emphasis, as if the truth, once seen, did not need to be repeated, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was definitive. It marked the end of one version of reality and the beginning of another. And in that space, Hayes understood, not fully yet, not completely, but enough to realize that the moment he thought he controlled had never belonged to him at all. The name lingered in the air like a final note that refused to fade, and for a moment no one spoke. Not the crowd, not the man from the United States Marshal Service, and certainly not Officer Hayes, because the weight of what had just been revealed did not allow for immediate response. It demanded processing, recalibration, and above all, recognition. Hayes' jaw tightened slightly as he straightened his uniform, a reflex more than a decision, as if posture alone could restore something that had already slipped beyond his control. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a different tone now, quieter, more measured, the sharp edge replaced by something closer to restraint. "Judge Carter," he said, testing the title as if saying it aloud might help him fully grasp it, might help him reorganize the moment into something manageable. But the words did not give him back what he had lost, they only confirmed it. Naomi met his gaze without change, her expression steady, not cold, not warm, simply resolved. And in that stillness there was no need for her to assert anything further, because the authority she carried was already understood, already present in every detail of the scene, from the arrival of the sedan to the quiet vigilance of the men positioned nearby. "This is a misunderstanding," Hayes added after a brief pause, the sentence forming carefully, deliberately, as if each word were chosen to rebuild a narrative that had begun to collapse. But even as he spoke, the attempt felt incomplete, because the moment itself no longer supported that version of events. It had moved beyond it. Naomi let the silence follow his statement, not interrupting, not correcting, simply allowing the space to exist, and in that space, the truth seemed to settle more clearly than any argument could have, because there was nothing left to reinterpret, nothing left to negotiate. The man from the Marshal's Service shifted slightly, his presence now more pronounced, not through movement, but through attention, and when he spoke, his voice remained calm, precise, carrying the kind of authority that did not need to rise to be heard. "Officer Hayes, we are going to need you to step back," he said, and the phrasing was careful, professional, but unmistakable in its direction, because it was no longer a suggestion, it was a transition of control. Hayes hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but long enough for it to be noticed, long enough for the shift to register. Not only with him, but with everyone watching. And then he took a small step back, not dramatic, not exaggerated, but enough to mark the boundary that had just been redrawn. The crowd reacted in subtle ways, a quiet murmur passing through them, not loud, not disruptive, but present, because they understood now, not fully perhaps, but enough to recognize that the balance of power had changed, that what had begun as a routine confrontation had become something entirely different. Naomi adjusted her coat slightly, smoothing it into place with the same composed precision she had carried from the beginning. And when she spoke again, her voice remained even, but there was a clarity to it now that left no room for misinterpretation. "This is not a misunderstanding, officer," she said, her words deliberate, each one landing with quiet certainty. "This is exactly what has been happening." And though she did not elaborate, did not expand, the implication settled heavily, because it pointed beyond the moment, beyond the street, towards something larger, something that had not started here and would not end here. Hayes' eyes shifted briefly, not away from her, but inward, as if measuring the distance between what he had believed and what now stood in front of him. And for the first time since the encounter began, there was no immediate response, no quick assertion, only a pause that spoke louder than anything he could have said, because in that pause was the realization that the situation was no longer his to control, no longer his to define. And as the faint sound of another vehicle approached in the distance, blending into the city's rhythm, it became clear to everyone present that this moment was not closing, it was unfolding, and whatever came next would not be decided by him. The distant vehicle came into view slowly, its presence more deliberate than urgent, and as it approached the curb behind the black sedan, the atmosphere shifted once again, not with noise or chaos, but with a quiet tightening that seemed to draw every eye, every breath, into a single point of focus. Officer Hayes noticed it immediately this time. His attention pulled away from Naomi just long enough to register the marked unit coming to a stop, and when the doors opened, 2 additional officers stepped out, their expressions unreadable, their movements controlled, And for the first time since this encounter began, Hayes was no longer the central figure in uniform. The subtle hierarchy of the moment rearranged itself without announcement, without instruction, but with unmistakable clarity. Naomi remained still, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady, as if everything unfolding around her was expected, as if this sequence had already been set into motion long before Hayes ever stepped forward on that sidewalk. The man from the United States Marshal Service glanced briefly toward the arriving officers, then back toward Naomi, a silent exchange passing between them, one that required no words because its meaning was already understood. Hayes shifted his stance again, his shoulders tightening as he tried to assess the new dynamic, but the situation no longer offered him the same access, the same control he had relied on moments earlier. "What is going on here?" one of the newly arrived officers asked, his voice neutral but firm, addressing the scene as a whole rather than any single individual. And for a brief second, Hayes seemed ready to respond, to step forward, to reclaim the narrative. But the words did not come as quickly as they once would have, and that hesitation did not go unnoticed. The marshal stepped slightly forward, his presence aligning with the new arrivals, and spoke with calm authority. "We will take it from here," he said, the statement simple, direct, and final in a way that did not invite debate. The officer nodded once, acknowledging the shift without question, because the structure of authority was now clear, visible in the positioning, in the tone, in the absence of resistance. Hayes exhaled slowly, a controlled breath that carried more weight than it should have, and his eyes moved once more to Naomi, searching for something, perhaps an explanation, perhaps a reversal, but finding neither, because she offered nothing beyond the truth already revealed. "Judge Carter," he said again, quieter now, the title no longer a test but an acknowledgement, and in that moment, the balance between them had fully inverted, not through force, not through confrontation, but through clarity, through the quiet unveiling of reality that could not be undone. Naomi inclined her head slightly, not in concession, not in approval, but in recognition of the moment as it stood, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same measured calm, but with a deeper resonance. Now, something that extended beyond the immediate scene. "Officer Hayes, this interaction is being documented," she said, and though the statement was simple, its implications settled heavily, because it confirmed what had already begun to take shape, that this was not an isolated moment, not a misunderstanding confined to a single street, but part of something larger, something structured, something that had been building quietly beneath the surface. The crowd absorbed this shift in near silence, their earlier curiosity replaced by a more focused attention, an awareness that they were witnessing not just a confrontation, but a turning point, and the phones that had been raised earlier now held steady with a different purpose, capturing not spectacle, but consequence. Hayes' posture adjusted once more, but this time not in assertion, not in control, but in response, in recognition of the position he now occupied within the unfolding reality. And though he remained standing in the same place, the ground beneath him no longer belonged to him in the way it had before, because the moment had moved beyond his reach, beyond his authority, into something far more deliberate, far more inevitable than he had ever anticipated. The realization did not arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, piece by piece, settling into the space like a weight that could no longer be ignored, and Officer Hayes stood there in the center of it, no longer directing the moment but existing within it, surrounded by a structure that had quietly formed around him. The newly arrived officers positioned themselves with subtle precision, not aggressive, not confrontational, but clearly aligned with the authority that had now taken control, and the man from the United States Marshal Service stepped slightly closer, his attention steady, his tone unchanged as he spoke again. "Officer Hayes, we are going to need your cooperation." And the phrasing was careful, but the meaning was unmistakable, because the roles had shifted completely. Hayes' eyes moved between the faces around him, the marshal, the other officers, and finally back to Naomi, searching for some indication that this could still be redirected, that this could still be contained. But what he found instead was certainty, not imposed, not forced, but present in a way that left no room for reinterpretation. "This is not necessary," Hayes said, his voice controlled but lower now, as if volume itself had lost its effectiveness, and for the first time, the words carried a trace of uncertainty that had not been there before, a subtle acknowledgement that the ground beneath him was no longer stable. Naomi listened without interruption, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady, and when she responded, her voice carried that same calm clarity that had defined her from the beginning. "It became necessary long before today," she said. And though the statement was brief, it extended beyond the moment, pointing to something that had been building quietly, something that had not started on this street, but had led directly to it. The crowd remained still, their earlier murmurs replaced by a focused silence, because the scene no longer resembled anything routine. It had moved into something deeper, something that carried consequence, and the phones that remained raised now captured not tension, but transition, the shift from assumption to accountability. The marshal nodded slightly, acknowledging Naomi's words, and then turned his attention back to Hayes, his expression composed, his tone steady. "We are going to review what just occurred," he said, and the simplicity of the statement carried more weight than any accusation could have, because it was not about argument, it was about process, about documentation, about a system now turning its focus inward. Hayes exhaled again, slower this time, his shoulders easing not in relief, but in recognition, because the moment no longer allowed for resistance in the way he understood it. It required something else, something closer to acceptance, and though he remained standing, his presence had changed, no longer the center of authority, but a part of the situation being evaluated. Naomi adjusted her stance slightly, her coat settled back into place, her composure intact, and as she looked at Hayes, there was no hostility in her expression, no visible anger, only a quiet resolve that spoke louder than any confrontation could have, because this was never about reacting, it was about revealing. "You asked what I was doing here," she said, her voice even, and the words carried a subtle weight as they bridged the moment back to its beginning. "I was observing," and the simplicity of that answer reframed everything, because it confirmed what had already begun to take shape, that this encounter was not random, not isolated, but part of a larger pattern being brought into the light. Hayes lowered his gaze briefly, not in defeat, but in thought, as if tracing back through the sequence of events, seeing them now from a perspective he had not considered before, and when he looked up again, the certainty that had once defined him was no longer there in the same way, replaced instead by a quieter, more measured awareness of where he now stood within the unfolding reality. The city continued around them, cars passing, distant sounds blending into the background. But within that small space on the sidewalk, something had shifted permanently, something that could not be undone, because the moment had revealed more than just an action. It had revealed a truth, and once seen, that truth carried forward, beyond the crowd, beyond the street, into whatever came next. The moment did not end with noise or sudden movement. It settled instead into a quiet clarity that lingered long after the tension had passed, and Officer Hayes stood there, no longer resisting, no longer attempting to reshape what had already been revealed, but simply present within it, his posture no longer rigid with authority, but held in a way that suggested something deeper had begun to take hold, something that could not be undone with words or explanations. The marshal gave a small nod to the officers beside him, and without urgency, without spectacle, they moved with measured coordination, not as an act of force but as part of a process that had already begun, before anyone on that sidewalk realized it. And Hayes responded in kind, not with argument, not with defiance, but with a quiet compliance that spoke louder than any protest could have, because the reality of the situation no longer left space for anything else. The crowd, once drawn in by curiosity, now remained in a different kind of silence, one shaped not by anticipation but by understanding, as if each person present recognized that what they had witnessed was not just a moment, but a turning point, something that extended beyond a single interaction into a larger truth about power, perception, and accountability. Naomi Carter stood exactly where she had been from the beginning, composed, steady, her presence unchanged, and as she watched the scene unfold, there was no visible triumph in her expression, no sense of victory. Only a quiet resolve that reflected the purpose she had carried into this moment long before it ever began. The city continued around them, the distant sounds of traffic blending into the background, people passing at the edges of the scene, unaware of what had just shifted within that small space. But for those who remained, the weight of it was undeniable. Hayes glanced once more toward Naomi, not with the certainty he had once held, but with something more reflective, more grounded, as if seeing her not as a subject of authority, but as the embodiment of something he had failed to recognize until now. And though no apology was spoken, no words offered to undo what had been done, the silence between them carried its own meaning, one that did not need to be voiced to be understood. Naomi met his gaze briefly, not to challenge, not to judge, but to acknowledge the moment for what it was, a line drawn not by force, but by truth. And as she turned slightly, stepping away from the center of the scene, the focus shifted with her, not because she demanded it, but because she had already changed it. The marshal spoke quietly to the officers, their conversation low and procedural, and the structure of the moment continued forward, steady, deliberate, as it moved beyond the public eye and into the systems designed to handle what had just been revealed. The phones that had once captured the confrontation slowly lowered, their purpose fulfilled, their recordings now carrying a story that would travel far beyond that street, far beyond that day. And as the crowd began to disperse, the energy of the moment did not disappear. It lingered, carried in the minds of those who had seen it, those who would remember it. And as Naomi walked forward, her steps calm, unhurried, blending back into the rhythm of the city, the truth of what had happened remained behind her, not as something loud or dramatic, but as something far more powerful, something that did not need to shout to be heard, because in the end, he believed he was enforcing the law, but what he did not understand was that the law had been standing in front of him all along.